We have Caroline, who is the chair of the New Zealand Accounting Standard Boards. She sits on the Australian Accounting Standard Boards and the Practitioner Advisory Group of International Financial Reporting for non-profit organisation projects. Zoe has been a policy advocate in areas of audit, assurance, financial reporting, and other external reporting at AFAANZ for over 10 years. Ram is Senior Manager Reporting and Audit Policy with the Policy and Advocacy team at CPA Australia. And David is convener of the Centre for Public Value at the University of Western Australia, where he's also Chief Investigator and convener of Australian Non-Profit Accounting Standards Project. So we'll start with Caroline, and the panel in general would be addressing changes that have happened to the public sector and not-for-profit reporting landscape. And also the future directions, where we're heading, and what are the challenges that these sectors are likely to face in terms of their reporting. Over to you, Caroline.
Thanks, Ushi, and welcome to everyone today. Kia ora tatou from New Zealand. Now, Ushi has asked me to comment on changes in the public sector reporting in the last decade, and I want to start a little bit earlier than that with this diagram, which comes from a paper that I wrote with Kevin Simpkins a few years ago, and at the end of my slides I've got some references so that you can find that out. And the reason I wanted to start here is because New Zealand was seen as pretty much world leading when public sector financial reports were prepared from 1995 onwards in an accrual sense. And then you can see on the left-hand side that when Australia decided to go with IFRS, that was adopted across the board in a sector and transaction neutral manner. It was pretty essential for the capital market, but the impact was felt very quickly in the public sector because local authorities had to prepare long-term plans in 2005, so there were very early adopters. In this paper that we wrote, we looked at how the standard setters approach to sector or transaction neutrality was unsuccessful in meeting public sector users' needs. And in the middle of this timeline, we had a very vocal Auditor General who engaged with standard setting and led to the establishment of today the External Reporting Board, or the XRB as it's known, with the two technical boards of the New Zealand Accounting Standards Board and the New Zealand Auditing and Assurance Standards Board. And so within this new strategy that occurred from 2012 onwards, a multi-standards framework was created, and we adapted a lot of the AFAANZ standards for use in the public sector and the not-for-profit sector, as Zoe will describe to us. We call these entities PBEs, public benefit entities, and we do try to have the same standards as much as possible between the for-profit and the not-for-profit, but that they are adapted to be used in the sector. So I just wanted to very briefly talk about what these standards look like, because they're mainly, as I said, adapted AFAANZ or International Public Sector Accounting Standards. AFAANZ-B, as many of you probably know, works with an IFAC. It has 18 members drawn from around the world, including Todd Beardsworth from New Zealand's Office of the Auditor General. And you can see here this the degree of public sector specificity of the standards that are issued. It looks like the key has disappeared here, but you can imagine the larger the pie chart, the more it actually shows that there's unique information in there rather than just IFRS. So you can see the largest number of standards that AFAANZ issue have public sector guidance added to IFRS. And I've popped the web link along the bottom there if anyone is interested in tracking that and looking more into the public sector area. Obviously, there's specific issues such as social benefits that are dealt with purely by AFAANZ. So one issue we have in New Zealand is what we call a mixed group issue. For example, when you've got SOEs that use for-profit standards and they're controlled by a public sector entity, and the consolidated reports have to come out with New Zealand PBE standards. So any changes that we make in New Zealand go through a process with the standards to see if they need to be adapted more for the public sector. Now, Ushi asked us to come up with 3 challenges for public sector reporting. And I thought, well, there's way more than 3, but can I just say new standards dealing with them, as well as changes that have to be made to reporting. So add up to more than 3. So what I've got in the next slide is some of the major changes that are coming through in the next little while. Revenue is particularly problematic. Those of you in the sector will know that recognising grants that are multi-period is problematic, and that also relates to transfer expenses. So there's a big project that's nearing an end to that, and we're all looking to see how that comes out. Measurement, including infrastructure assets and heritage assets. There's going to be revised requirements for measurement and initial recognition, subsequent measurement and disclosures as well, and a new base called current operational value, which we're still trying to work out where the AFAANZ is going to land on a definition, but it will be an alternative to fair value where that's inappropriate to be used. Leases is out, but there is the whole question of concessionary leases, which is an issue in the public sector, those low value leases, and there is a recognition that lessees and lessors still enter into a contract that conveys the right to use of the underlying asset, and the deliberations at the moment are suggesting that lessees will have to recognise these at the asset value. So watch this space, that's another challenge that's coming up. And the whole sustainability issue. So should the AFAANZ become a standard setter in this space? It is currently consulting on that and will be making a decision in December. So these are all challenges in the public sector. And if I was allowed to add one more to this, I would say the issue of service performance reporting, which has a new standard in New Zealand, which we developed domestically, and where the Office of the Auditor General is trying to develop capacity. So there's a lot of challenges. She asked us to comment on where more research could guide standard setting. And so I've got a list here for you to look at. I'm not going to make too many more comments around it. Obviously, the sustainability reporting and what should go into the general purpose financial reports and what should be left in other reports, how these are integrated with other considerations like natural resources are all issues that could well be researched. Differential reporting. Now we have differential reporting in New Zealand as you do in Australia, tier 2, but many places around the world do not. So what's working in New Zealand and Australia? What isn't working? Should it be, how do we define what's a smaller entity? Is it just size or is it about risk? Other things, should it just be exemptions from disclosures or should it be a complete standard like the IFRS for SMEs where you actually have, a lot of carve-outs in that, which are not just about disclosures, but also about measurement and recognition. And then there is a large project starting up on presentation of financial statements. Should they be aligned with the system for national accounts? How do we bring in the non-financial and other forms of reporting? And then another juicy one, what about when going concern applies or doesn't apply to a government entity? And if we look across to the UK, we see a large number of local authorities that have been having issues recently. When does going concern not apply? Now, I would have to say that the AFAANZ has a academic advisory group, which I'm highlighting here at the bottom of the screen. And it's quite a good idea to look out for their calls for research, which they have done 3 years in a row. And that means they're probably likely to do it again, where they call for research and then, like the AASB, you can prepare some research and then present it to them. So lots of areas where research is needed to help the standards setting activities, and there are some references here, recent references from Agostino, which is around digital transformation, which of course I haven't talked about, and the Carrot Seamus one is a structured literature review on accounting education in public sector. And so I thought that could be useful to you as well, plus a reference there to the paper with Kevin, and reference to the Office of the Auditor General, which is around the problems, progress and potential of service performance reporting, which is very much a contentious issue. So I will stop sharing my screen here, and hopefully I have not gone over the 10 minutes allocated to me, and hand over, I think, to Zoe.
Thank you, Carolyn. Yes, Zoe, over to you about the New Zealand not-for-profit sector.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks very much for having me today to cover off the not-for-profit environment in New Zealand. So first of all, looking in the rearview mirror about what's happened in the last 10 years or so, there's been changes around both who should report and what should be reported. So it's legislation that determines who should report. So we had the Financial Reporting Amendment Act and the Financial Reporting Amendment to Other Enactments Act in 2013. And one of the biggest changes there was that required charities to prepare general purpose financial statements. So that means that they had to prepare their financial statements in accordance with the XRB standards, which was the first time that there was any prescription around how their financial statements had to be prepared. So concurrently with that, as it was then, the relatively newly formed XRB was doing a review of their accounting standards framework, probably more than a review, a reform even. The result of that saw the whole of New Zealand move from a sector neutral approach to standard setting to sector specific. Not only that, a multi-tier approach, and also the development of domestic standards for smaller not-for-profits, which were called the simple format reporting standards. And then a bit more specifically going into more common legal forms that not-for-profits take, the Incorporated Societies Act was undergoing a review by the Law Commission, and they issued their report in 2013 also. So that was quite a busy time. And that's not to say that work has since stopped, never stops. Obviously, that work around the incorporated societies has resulted in a new act, a 2022 Act, with the regulations currently under consultation now. And also, there has been an ongoing project which started in May 2018 to modernise the Charities Act. So, in summary, there's been a significant amount of change in New Zealand in the not-for-profit sector over the past decade. In terms of the challenges, obviously, more broadly speaking, the not-for-profit sector has a number of challenges, obviously, that are quite unique or particularly prevalent in the not-for-profit space. But in relation to reporting specifically, I think keeping accounting records obviously is super important and is a challenge around data quality or data capture, possibly due to sort of unsophisticated systems and processes within the sector, and sort of weaker internal control environments. The second one, I think that capability there's a big challenge around that, in terms of the sector is quite heavily reliant on volunteers, and those volunteers quite often don't have the financial expertise in financial reporting. And finally, capacity. So obviously reporting takes time, and charities are very, very busy, doing their important work to fulfill their charitable purposes. So time is a big challenge there. So looking ahead now, and I have alluded to a few things that are coming up, but in the near future, what we should be looking out for, the XRB has recently consulted on revisions to the Tier 3 and 4 accounting requirements. I understand next year there will be a revised Tier 4 standard, followed by a revised Tier 3 standard. From the consultation, speaking very, very broadly, the feedback seemed to be very, very supportive of what was proposed, and essentially it was informed by a post-implementation review, so that's not really surprising. And the post-implementation review showed a desire for more requirements for Tier 3 and less requirements for Tier 4. As I already mentioned, we've got a new Incorporated Societies Act, so that actually requires larger incorporated societies to prepare financial statements in accordance with the XRB standards. And we've also got the Charities Amendment Bill, which is currently before the Select Committee. So they're seeking submissions, and the submission deadline has been extended, which is good, from the 10th of November to the 9th of December. So that's actually proposing exemption powers to the Chief Executive of the DIA to exempt a class of entities from needing to prepare their financial statements in accordance with XRB standards. And that threshold is to be prescribed by regulations. So the regulations, I assume, will be consulted on later down the track as well. So a few moving parts in that space. And then once I think all of that settles, the charity services will be consulting on revisions to the annual return to make sure all requirements are aligned. So looking a bit further forward into the more distant future, around changes that are potentially would like to be seen in the sector. I personally don't really want any more changes. The not-for-profit sector in New Zealand's undergone a lot of changes already, which I think really need time to bed in. But obviously, as with any changes, they will need to have a post-implementation review to ensure that they're achieving their intended purpose, and that there's no unintended consequences. Another area which is a bit of a hobby horse of mine is around what's in entities' founding documents, so their rules or constitutions, etc., around reporting and audit. So given that legislation, is prescriptive around the requirements for financial reporting and assurance, I would urge all not-for-profit entities to review their constitutions to see if they need to be revised in light of the new legislative requirements. And if anything, leave it to legislative requirements, so take it out of their constitutions altogether, unless there is a reason to go above and beyond what legislation is prescribing. I think there also needs to be a piece of work around education of funding providers, or awareness raising of funding providers, and what they request as part of grant applications. So again, that aligns with not asking more of not-for-profits than what they're required to do by law, and having more targeted approaches to show accountability. And also another area of interest of mine that I often contemplate is the structure of charities regulation in New Zealand. So I'm sure that you will be aware that the Charities Commission was disestablished at a time of, public sector entity rationalisation, and it was replaced with the DIA charity services. So although they do have a independent registration board, DIA charity services as a regulator, sits within the same body as the policymaker, which is, I think, quite unique in terms of when you compare to other regulatory models around the world. And then finally, because I think my time is up, 3 pieces of further reading I would recommend. There's some useful information on the Companies Office about what incorporated societies need to do because of the new Act. Have your say on the Charities Amendment Bill, really, really important. Help shape what that legislation is going to end up looking like. And have a read of the XRB consultation papers on the Tier 3 and 4 standard to get an idea of the direction of travel of those. Yeah, I think I'm handing it over to you, Ram.
Thank you, Zoe.
Kia ora.
Over to you, Ram, about the Australian not-for-profit sector.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Ushi, also. I'm just going to share my screen, and I hope everyone can see that. So I'm just going to quickly move through. So if I were to be asked to say, what are the 3 big challenges for not-for-profits in the Australian not-for-profit sector, I would probably say resources 3 times, because I think that's definitely one that the sector has a very short supply of. And so we really need to look at regulation of the not-for-profit sector, which is fit for purpose and consistent. A lot of work has already happened in that space and is continuing to happen, and some of the material that I'm going to talk to today will reflect upon that work. I think the first thing I'd probably mention is the last one in that slide, which is the skills shortages in the sector, which is very acute. It is probably going to get even more acute as we progress through the next year and beyond. The budget was announced yesterday. It's still being unpacked as we speak. One of the issues that we've got with the sector here is a shortage of volunteers, and that obviously will have an impact on many aspects of not-for-profits, including their ability to prepare financial reports and other reports for regulatory purposes, and also to satisfy the information needs of users. That's still an issue that needs to be addressed. So that is one challenge. The other one is the fit for purpose financial reporting solution that we need. Zoe touched on what they have in New Zealand, which is, I think, quite well designed and really fit for purpose. And we are moving there in Australia. We've got the AASB now working on its Tier 3 reporting standard, which I will flick to now. So the current position is, of course, you've got tier 1 and tier 2, which is primarily based on IFRS, and then you've got everyone else doing special purpose if they're not a reporting entity, and that's the case for the not-for-profit sector as it prepares financial reports under the accounting standards. And the future, of course, is going to look a bit different. Tier 1, tier 2 again will still remain for the larger end of town in the not-for-profit sector. The new tier 3 standard is going to be a simplification of recognition, measurement, and disclosure requirements. And the consultation on that is already out, and the AASB is trying very, very hard to make sure the sector is aware of what's in the proposals. And I think we, as a collective, need to be making sure that everyone in the sector has an opportunity to at least look at the high-level proposals and provide feedback to the AASB so they shape that standard in the right way. And the AASB is very keen to hear feedback from stakeholders to make sure that they design that standard in the appropriate manner. A great piece of work, I have to say, on first reading, and they've done all the right things, I think, in terms of simplification. There is obviously work to be done around the edges, but the broad direction seems to be going in the right way. But that still leaves a few questions, and that brings to me one other challenge, which is around because this is going to apply to those who prepare financial statements in accordance with accounting standards, Australian accounting standards. What about those who don't have to prepare financial statements in accordance with Australian accounting standards? And that is an issue that we're already facing here in Australia for for-profits who have now moved to this full GPFS model. And we've had to do all sorts of tweaks to the framework to make sure that we correctly capture those who refer to accounting standards and those who don't refer to accounting standards either fall out, or there may be some in-between solution for disclosures, etc. So there's a few issues that need to be considered, and I think that's relevant to the not-for-profit space. And I actually think it's more relevant to the not-for-profit space because of the quite diverse nature of regulatory requirements that we have in Australia, which, although there is a move to make them more consistent, it's still a work in progress. So just moving on to the detail around that future financial reporting framework relating to Tier 3, there's simplification in revenue, lease accounting, fair value, consolidation, cash flow statements, all brilliant, personally speaking. Simple language for sure, but the question will still remain around who is going to apply the Tier 3 standard. And although the AASB has said it's probably expecting someone with revenue between $500,000 to $3 million, so that's what you would expect that's a medium-sized charity under the ACNC requirements. Not everyone has those thresholds when we're looking at the regulatory landscape in Australia. Even companies limited by guarantee don't have that threshold. What I mean by that is in the Corporations Act, companies limited by guarantee, which are largely not-for-profits, have a different threshold for medium-sized companies limited by guarantee. They still refer back to the old thresholds, which is $250,000 to $1 million in revenue. So that hasn't been changed. And then, of course, when we go to the state territory level, there are very significant differences across the states and territories in terms of thresholds for financial reporting. And if we look at a state like Queensland, for example, there's no reference to accounting standards at all in their legislation for incorporated associations. So how are we going to operationalize the Tier 3 standard for incorporated associations in Queensland? Don't know the answer to that yet. So those are the kinds of questions that we need to be addressing as we move through to this new Tier 3 reporting standard, which will bring about consistency to reporting in the not-for-profit space. That is the expectation. I also quickly wanted to touch on an issue that is probably relevant to research as well as standard setting and advocacy, which is what I do as a day job. The role of audit versus review, it continues to remain a cause for concern. And what I mean by that is, although there is the ability for many not-for-profits which are considered medium-sized to have their financial statements reviewed, anecdotally and empirically, we are seeing that that is not happening. So what's happening is that those medium-sized not-for-profits are choosing to have their financials audited rather than reviewed, even though they have the ability to have them reviewed. Why is that? Well, the reasons given are in the following. One, the practitioners who conduct the audits or the reviews are of the view that the review actually doesn't reduce the work effort that much. So therefore the cost doesn't reduce that much. And therefore, you might as well go for that gold standard of audit. So that's one. Two is there's obviously many not-for-profits which have written into their constitution the requirement to have an audit. And some of these documents can be quite old. And so that could be another issue that is driving not-for-profits towards an audit versus review. And of course, there's the general perception issue where not-for-profits themselves, boards of not-for-profits themselves might feel more comfortable with the word audit and what it signifies, and therefore have an audit done rather than have a review. And in my experience, having been here in Australia for the last 10 years, that is quite an interesting perception that I see. My previous life, I was in the UK, where they have something called independent examinations, which is effectively a review, and that is quite popular. So I'm not quite sure why that particular type of engagement hasn't picked up in Australia. It's written into legislation, so there is an expectation from the lawmakers and regulators that reviews will happen, but it's not happening. So that's one that we do need to consider. And I've thrown in a couple of possible ways forward, including the possible less complex entities auditing standard from the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board, which has its supporters and detractors. So that's one that we need to think about. Of course, scalability of auditing standards themselves could be an issue that may address some of the challenges we've got with this area. So I thought I'll just throw those things in as well. And quickly moving on, I'll just mention a couple of references. CP Australia commissioned some research around the decision usefulness or the information needs that users of annual reports of Australian not-for-profit organizations want. And there's some insights collected through an interview process that is collected into a report that was published earlier this year. I've put a link in there for you to have a look at that particular report. Although I wasn't asked to speak about public sector, I will just mention that we are about to publish another report which is similar to the not-for-profit one that I just mentioned, but looking at the decision usefulness of annual reports from public sector entities. We're expecting to publish that either by the end of this year or early next year. So please go to that link at the bottom of that page to see what that might look like. And the last one is our charities guide, which somewhat brings into focus the challenges that we've got with the diverse regulatory landscape that we still have in Australia, in spite of the ACNC having done some stellar work in bringing consistency to regulation and reporting in particular across the states and territories and across the Commonwealth. It's still an ongoing challenge. There's still a need for that streamlining of regulation, which has to happen. So that guide will tell you some of the differences that are there between the requirements of the ACNC and some of the requirements that are in place across the states and territories, and even with the Commonwealth. Like the example that I just gave of how the thresholds are different for companies limited by guarantee compared to charities. So that's just, and that's at the Commonwealth. And another example would be the Office for the Registrar of Indigenous Corporations. They have their own thresholds, and they have their own financial reporting requirements, once again different. So there is a question that needs to be asked here as to why do we have these differences, what justifies these differences, and is there a way of actually making them simpler and more streamlined? And those are the discussions that we probably need to have as we move forward into the future. So I hope I've said enough there, Ushi, and I'll pass to David, I think.
Thank you, Ram. Thank you very much. So over to you, David, to talk about the Australian public and not-for-profit sector.
Thanks very much, Ushi, and to AFAANZ and Chartered Accountants for including me in this panel, and thanks to my colleagues as well. I think it's always really a risk going last on a panel like this because the issues that have been identified have been great, and I've thoroughly enjoyed each presentation. So thank you, Carolyn, Zoe and Ram for that contribution. So I kind of thinking along those lines in terms of my personal risk presenting today, I took a slightly different view in terms of thinking about the Australian public sector reporting challenges, weaknesses, prospects and so on by taking some straw polls in some discussions as I've got around a few parliaments and done some work in the area in recent months. And particularly I was a little bit disappointed, Ram, because your first comment saying resources, 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 exactly I think replicates in the public sector. And indeed, I think the not-for-profit and public sector in terms of accounting standards are natural allies, not necessarily in terms of the solutions and results of work that might be undertaken, but certainly in terms of many of the challenges. And in Australia, I think a foundational issue has been the year-on-year effect of 3% efficiency dividends in funding to departments, which have all most uniformly been applied to administrative capacity within those departments rather than applied to other aspects of the work of government agencies. And that, of course, means that analytical capability, reporting capability, etc., are all very thin and very challenged in most Australian jurisdictions, if not all. So I think that's a really important issue to think about in terms of the capacity of governments moving forward to be able to meet the reporting challenges. I think the other thing is to say that, of course, the landscape of the challenges faced by public sector reporting in Australia really includes many of the usual suspects, if you like. And Carolyn did a great review of a number of challenges as well as prospective solutions or work being done. But certainly things like valuation of cultural assets, what's a Parliament House worth and how should it be reported, etc., are always ongoing issues for governments. But so too are things like appropriate discount rates, etc. All of those things are important, but what might be really interesting, and it builds a little bit on what Carolyn said, is that there's increasing interest amongst practitioners and public sector auditors in Australia to start to look at things like differentiation between larger and smaller entities. So looking at risk, for instance, as being a attribute that might be considered in terms of what needs to be reported and what doesn't in order to achieve efficiencies in financial reporting going forward. That then has potential issues in relation to consolidations or whole of government reporting, of course. But there are it's a really attractive idea to look at these things because in all jurisdictions in Australia, for instance, there's entities sitting there that are effectively defunct but are awaiting repealing legislation that the Parliament is not prioritising because they have other work to do, and therefore Auditors General and other regulators are frequently auditing agencies and activity that don't have any activities and that end up costing the taxpayer resources that could be applied elsewhere, of course. The other thing that is really interesting in relation to public sector financial reporting relates to the users' needs. And principally, I think most departments take the principal users of their financial reports as being the parliaments. And that makes sense because they all have to lodge their reports in parliaments in jurisdictions in Australia, as does the government as a whole. The Treasury as a whole tend to table a whole of government report of some description. What we've found in our straw poll is that when we talk to members of parliament about financial reports, they actually don't care about the content of the financial reports or the audit of the financial reports in terms of that, the auditor's report and outcome, unless there is something that they should be worried about. In other words, by and large, the straw polls indicated that people weren't concerned to see the reports, but they were concerned and very happy that the reports were being created. The Auditor General was doing the work that the Auditor General does to assure those reports, on the basis that they then expected to be told if there was something that needed to be informed to them or to the Parliament. And that's quite a different perspective that we take perhaps in terms of decision usefulness and users of financial reports in other sectors, where we have an expectation that not only will they receive those reports, but they'll actually use them, read them, make decisions in relation to them, rather than on a as needs basis or on a exceptions basis, if you like. The other thing that has been a real challenge for most preparers, but also, I guess, centrally for treasuries, is the issue of the system of national accounts, which Carolyn also flagged as an issue, and I think an important one, and the disparity between what accounting reports require and what national accounts require, and then what international reporting obligations that Australian jurisdictions have require, and reconciling those elements. With an already stretched treasury and financial department system in most jurisdictions in Australia, that's also adding to some of the concern in terms of how efficiencies can be created through the accounting standards process. The other element that I think is a really important element that's starting to be talked about much more earnestly, again, picks up on Carolyn's final slide, I think it was, in relation to sustainability reporting. And of course, the Australian Accounting Standards Board have added that to their project list in terms of things that they would like to see explored and evaluated. Sustainability reporting, of course, is absolutely crucial for governments, as it is for private enterprise and not-for-profit organisations, and it is interesting to see that this is starting to come to the top of mind of preparers and treasury personnel as well. The other point that I'd like to talk to is probably a little bit forward-looking and considering the broader financial governance processes of Westminster parliaments in Australia, and I guess identifying some of the key things that I think are potential areas for research, certainly potential areas for reform, but currently are significant issues to my mind in terms of achieving governance outcomes for the general publics in which these parliaments operate. The first element is, of course, that we have general purpose financial reports essentially prepared by all departments. We have a whole of government report that's not necessarily a consolidation, but nevertheless, it purports to put forward a materially correct picture of the government, its position and performance in a certain period. But we don't have, and we have assurance over those documents and considerable regulatory frameworks, notwithstanding each jurisdiction doesn't mandatorily apply the accounting standards in terms of financial management legislation, but certainly the treasuries use accounting standards as part of their policy frameworks and developing models. Where I think there's a real problem, though, is that in pushing forward in terms of the decision usefulness of those reports and that primary audience of the members of parliament, indicating, again, I'm stressing a straw poll, not any sort of empirical evidence, but indicating that there's a suggestion that members of parliament are really happy to see these things done, but want a exception reporting process rather than necessarily having the reports to read through. But one of the big problems, or one of the big issues, is that media very rarely picks up on the financial reports of the parliaments or of the governments. But what they do is pick up, as we all know, on the budget process. And we've just had the Commonwealth budget handed down yesterday in Australia. But the budget cycle is not audited. Generally, it is fairly flexible in terms of how budget is compiled and also how results are subsequently reported, underlying surpluses and all of the different phraseology that's used to meet the, I guess, the political requirements of treasurers and governments. And I think this is a real hole in terms of the governance framework of public sector financial reporting in Australia. So having the budget cycle essentially unassured and essentially, though the most significant public set of documents and the most significantly talked about document in the Australian polity, but not having standards around that or assurance around that, I think is a big issue. And so one of the things that I think would be really interesting is how we look to reconcile the budget prospectively and the budget outcomes in retrospect in the context of the accounting reports that are actually ultimately produced in terms of those Treasury outcomes. Not only in terms of the actual year that's being reported, but also to the extent to which the out years are actually thought about deeply and actually concise and appropriate to reporting to the community what's going to happen over the next 4 years within the jurisdiction. And we're all aware of massive changes in those out years and common parlance within the public sectors in Australia is that you get things into the out years cycle. It doesn't really matter what they enter in when they're at the year 4 because no one really cares. At the end of the day, the government might not be there, but we're then starting to tighten up as the out year becomes more and more proximal, if you like, to the operating budget. So I think that's a big area and an important area because it is the budget that is actually the one that the community looks at and is probably the most talked about, but the least substantively arranged in terms of regulatory framework, if you like. The final point that I would make, then I think I'm coming up to the end of my time, is that one of the things that Ushi asked me to consider was possible reading, and I'm probably being hopefully not egocentric, but certainly being a bit selfish because there's 2 reports that I wanted to name in relation to these sets of issues. And they're actually a 2012 report and a 2013 report that Robin Pilcher at Curtin University and I wrote for the Heads of Treasury Accounting and Reporting Advisory Committee here in Australia, the HOTARAC committee, which consists of all of the reporting folk from each treasury in each state and territory, as well as the Commonwealth. And those reports looked at cataloguing the key issues in relation to financial reporting for government and then making some suggestions in the context of reduced disclosure regime. Now, I'm not saying they're still pristine and perfect documents, but there is a catalogue of issues in those reports that may help people in terms of identifying topics that are useful. And I think there's still a certain amount of currency in relation to those documents. I think I'm just about out of time, Ushi, so I'm happy to hand over there for questions if anyone's got them.
Thank you, David. You're spot on time. So if we have any questions in the chat box, we might start taking them. And none at the moment. So I might ask a question actually. There's been a lot of changes. You've spoken about the challenges for the sector. And it seems to be more moving forward in terms of, improving disclosures and transparency in the public and not-for-profit sector. But do you believe that a key challenge remains in terms of how users appreciate information being made available to them? So any one of you, say it's for the panel. Yeah, Carolyn.
Ushi,
Yeah.
I'll start this off. And one of the questions that worries me is because public sector reporting is obviously for all citizens, not-for-profit reporting also has very wide readership. And so I worry about financial literacy at a very basic level, maths basically, and then more financial literacy. Which doesn't seem to be strong these days. And so that is part of the concern of how can we make reporting more acceptable to users. But secondly, let's face it, an annual report is not just about knowing how to read your numbers and, financial literacy. It's a financial reporting literacy. And this is where we look for middle people in the middle, mediators like the media, like summary reports, but certainly understandability of the product and trying to communicate with the users, and with the service performance reporting, the Office of the Auditor General in New Zealand is saying, don't just give us a whole raft of information narrative information about what you've achieved over the year. Go and ask your users what they want to know, which is an interesting thought. I see David wants to chip in as well.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I want to endorse entirely what you've said there, Carol, and I think that's the biggest challenge that we have. And just to simply add the codicil that the challenge for standard setters, for academics, for everyone involved in the discussion around what the standard should look like, is how we balance the requirement for simplification that's often called for with the requirement to actually raise the level of capacity of financial literacy. So in other words, we can't just simply keep going to the idea of simplicity being the solution when people are struggling to understand perhaps the information that's in there. I don't think that's the answer. So I think training and education are absolutely critical elements in relation to standard setting going forward.
Yes, Ram, you wanted to add something.
Thanks, Ushi. One aspect to consider, particularly looking at the not-for-profit sector, is the trust and confidence angle. And I've heard definitely one example where a fairly well-known foundation will only give money to people who are registered with the ACNC. Now, they don't necessarily see their financial statements or delve into their affairs in giving them money, but that's one of the first things that they're looking for. Now, that actually symbolizes something. It means that they're meeting their governance standards, they're meeting the legal requirements, they're meeting the financial reporting requirements, lodging them on a public record. So those are all things that actually add to that trust and confidence. Now, these people may not actually read the financial statements cover to cover, but the fact that it's lodged publicly means something. So I think that's quite an important thing to keep in mind as well. And that's where the fit for purpose or the proportionality of financial reporting comes in, because people are not looking for high quality gold standard financial reporting necessarily. They're looking for something that actually is meaningful and is proportional.
Thank you. Zoe, would you like to add something?
Yeah, the only thing I would like to add is something that I've seen in my capacity as a judge for the Charity Reporting Awards in New Zealand is, when we talk about, not-for-profits having very, very scarce resources, it's not overstating it at all. But then you see they have produced a beautiful annual report that's available on their website, but then they're preparing a separate set of financial statements to file with the charities services or charity regulator. And it goes back to, let's do one report for all purposes, and that is ultimately the definition of a general purpose financial report. What goes into that report should be sufficient for all users.
Thank you. We do have a question in the chat box. So Jackie is asking, a risk with mediators and simplified representations is framing and skewing the message to fit the preferred narrative of a mediator. We see this a lot in the media and within organizations, including boards. This is particularly important for financial reporting and annual reporting to support the purpose of accountability. Just wondering, what are the panel's thoughts on this issue? Thanks. Yeah, David.
Only to say, I think this is an enduring issue. I don't think, certainly in my career, I think it's always been the case. If you're in a company, you want to present your best face. If you're the government, you want to present your best face. If you're a not-for-profit, you want to present your best face. So it comes down to me, accounting professionalism, ethics, and our roles as remembering the attributes of what good information is to support decision making that the information might be used for.
Yes, Carolyn?
I think we also have to realise that the mediators could well be pension fund purchasers. And, you know, most of us have superannuation or pension funds, and we're happy to let those analysts and those people go off and buy government bonds, make green investments in perhaps social bonds, social impact bonds that are using those reports and analysing those reports, and we don't go off and double check them. So when you look at the number of people who are impacted by those mediators, they are actually reading the reports. But I do agree there is the opportunity for greenwashing by either the entity or by the green or blackwashing by the mediator. But you know, we don't have a tradition in New Zealand of summary reports as they may in the UK, and traditionally those are not assured in any way. So there's a question there as well. And given I know there's another question in the chat, but I wanted to pick up on what Ram was saying about independent examination. I would love to have that in New Zealand. We have no product, and it's one thing to say, you know, they should expunge audit or reviews from their rules, but many members of not-for-profits do want to have their some sort of assurance, agreed upon procedures, some sort of independent examination. And I would really love to see the profession and charity services work together to have something that can be useful to all of those charities that want to have just a second set of eyes looking over, not a full audit, just a second set of eyes to independently examine smaller entities' accounts.
I know they're all interesting. Yes.
Pushy, I'm so sorry. I have to go. I've got to go to a Viva Voce. Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, David. Bye.
Bye. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. We might quickly take the second question, and then being mindful of time, just have to close the whole session. So Jackie is asking again, financial literacy extends to the boards and management signing off on the reports. Research suggests directors and managers may not understand these reports themselves. Again, interested in the panel's thoughts on this issue too.
Well, that was one of the challenges that I noted for the not-for-profit sector in the context of New Zealand, and I would assume more broadly as well, is capability and the reliance on volunteers. And you know, we're constantly hearing around the rate of compliance within Tier 4 with the accounting standards being relatively low. And, you know, what's the solution? Let's simplify the requirements. But yeah, we would push back on that and say that upskilling is also required.
Thank you. Being mindful of time, we have to close today's session. But if you have any more questions or anything, feel free to send us an email, and I'm sure the panel will be more than happy to respond to your queries. Thank you very much, Caroline, Zoe, and Ram.